Likutei Sichos, Chelik Yud Zayin, Volume 17, the sicha for Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Chananya ben Akashya. For the 6 Shabbosim between Pesach and Shavuos, we read on each Shabbos another chapter from the 6 chapters of Pirkei Avot. And this is in order to prepare ourselves properly for Matan Torah, for the receiving of the Torah. Each week, prior to reciting the chapter of Pirkei Avot, we recite a Mishnah, Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelik Olam Haba, which says that every single Jew has a share in the world to come. And then when we complete the Perek, proceeding that reading of the chapter, we recite another Mishnah, Rabbi Chananya ben Akashya Omer, which we will expound on. So we're going to learn the meaning of this Mishnah, how it connects to Pirkei Avot, why it's connected, and it becomes inherently part of the recital of Pirkei Avot, and also we'll get a much deeper and better perspective of the purpose of Torah and mitzvos. So let's look into this. Let's read this Mishnah, this Tanaic saying. Rabbi Chananya ben Akashya Omer. Rabbi Chananya ben Akashya says, Ratza Kadosh Baruch Hu l'zakes es Yisrael. Hashem, the Almighty, blessed be He, wanted to make the children of Israel have many merits. He wanted to give them merit. And therefore, lefichach, therefore, hirba lahem Torah and mitzvahs. He gave them an abundance of Torah and mitzvot. Shenemar, as it says in the verse, Hashem chafetz leman sidko. Hashem desired, for the sake of His righteousness, yagdil Torah v'yadir. So He made Torah great and He glorified it. That's what the Mishnah says, and that's the proof, the backing that it brings up, as the Mishnah typically does, from a verse in the written Torah, in Torah Shabiksav. Now, although this Mishnah, its true place, in other words, its origin is in the tractate of Makos, yet the prevailing custom, in fact, perhaps everybody has this custom, that we all recite it right as we complete the chapter of Pirkei Avot. Each and every time we recite Pirkei Avot throughout these 6 weeks. So this seems to imply, this seems to give the notion that this has an inherent connection to Pirkei Avot, or at least became connected to Pirkei Avot. And to the extent that we find that all the commentaries, for almost all the commentaries that is, on the Pirkei Avot also explain this chapter as part of their ongoing commentary of Pirkei Avot. So the question is, what really is the connection? Especially considering that also prior to Pirkei Avot, we also recite a Mishnah which is also not inherently from Pirkei Avot, rather it comes from the tractate of Sanhedrin, and that Mishnah states, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelik olam haba. Every single Jew has a share in the world to come. Shenemar, as it says in the verse, V'amech, and your people, kulam tzadikim, they are all righteous, they're all merititious. La'olam yirshu aretz, all of them will certainly forever inherit the land, meaning inherit olam haba. Neitzer mata'ai ma'aseh yodai lehispar. They are the branch of my planting, Hashem says, and they are the work of my hands, lehispar, for my glorification. Now, although it's a Mishnah from Tractate Sanhedrin, still it becomes part and parcel of the recital of Pirkei Avot. And we can actually see that there is an inherent theme, a very common theme between these two Mishnahs, the one we say before Pirkei Avot, the one we recite post Pirkei Avot. And that is that both of them speak about the greatness, speak about, they highlight the importance of Am Yisrael, of the Jewish people. So we need to understand, if you think about it, what is Pirkei Avot? In other words, what is really Pirkei Avot, the bulk of it? What does it talk about? It discusses all kinds of morals, refined conduct, what I would call interpersonal behavior. And also it goes into milei de chasidusa, which means matters that are beyond the letter of the law, matters that are for extra refinement of one's self. And the question is, how does this specifically bring out, how does this specifically underscore, highlight the importance, the greatness of the Jewish people specifically? So in order to understand this, in order to get an appreciation of this, we'll first look at one of the primary commentaries on this Mishnah of Rabbi Chananya ben Akasha, and through understanding this, we'll get a better appreciation. The Rambam, Maimonides, explains that what does it mean that Hashem gave them an abundance of mitzvot? What is the purpose and abundance of mitzvot? How does that in any way glorify things? How does that in any way add to the merit, so to speak, of the Jewish people? Says the Rambam, because really every single person, in order to come to Olam Haba, in order to merit, to receive a portion of the world to come, must observe at least one mitzvah, must connect through at least one mitzvah that they do in its entirety, with its fullest kavanah, with its fullest intent, and without any fault. Now, in order for that to happen, there has to be many mitzvot, says the Rambam. Specifically because there are so many mitzvot, there's so many varying types of mitzvot, therefore it's more likely, or perhaps you can say even more highly likely, that every single person should at least be able to, sometime in his life, have performed one mitzvah, and one mitzvah properly, and its entirety. And that's why Hashem gave us so many mitzvot, according to the way the Rambam explains. But the question is, if that's the case, we need to have a little clarification. Because the wording, the expression that Rabbi Chananya ben Akasha uses is not that Hashem wanted to reward the Jewish people. At the end of the day, Olam Haba is a reward. But rather he uses the term lezakot, which means to give them merit. He should have said, Ratzah Kadosh Baruch Hu, lasei schar, to give them reward. And therefore, in order to make it possible, in order to make it more practically available to them, that's why he gave them so many mitzvot. So we need to understand that according to the Rambam's explanation. And also, another question, more fundamental question. It would seem, according to what the Rambam explains, that this whole increase in abundance of Torah mitzvot is not inherently for the purpose of the Torah mitzvot itself. In other words, it doesn't enhance the actual quality, the inherent quality of the Torah mitzvot. Rather, it's just that it becomes a means, it becomes like, so to speak, a vehicle, a tool through which the Jew can become enhanced. So it seems like it's kind of like degrading the Torah mitzvot. It's kind of pulling it down. Another few things that need to be understood in this, you see some things that seem to look or appear as discrepancies, which will be later explained. What does Rabbi Chananya say? Rabbi Chananya says that Hashem desired lezakot et bnei Yisrael, to increase merit for the Jewish people. And he brings for this the verse. But if you look at the verse, what does it say? Hashem chafetz leman sitko, that Hashem had a desire to increase his righteousness. Not the righteousness of the Jewish people, but his righteousness. So there seems to be a discrepancy. Number two, in the verse it says, Yagdil Torah v'yadir, that this makes the Torah great and glorified. Notice it doesn't mention mitzvah. But in his saying, what does it say? That Hashem gave an abundance of Torah and mitzvos. So he's using this verse as a reference, as a point of reference, but yet he says Torah and mitzvos. Number three, this is a little more refined, so to speak, a nuance, but still it means a lot and it plays a big role, where if you look in the expression that Rabbi Chananya ben Akasha uses, what does he say? Ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God wanted to bring merit to the Jewish people, and therefore he increased. He uses the expressive term of wanted, versus the verse. If you look in the verse, what does it say? Hashem chafetz. Chafetz means desired. Now, it may not sound like a big difference, but it is. There's a difference between desire and want, as we'll see later in the sicha. And then, when you look at the saying again, what he said Hashem Herba, Hashem made greater abundance. Abundance is what? In quantity. He made more, literally more Torah, more details in Torah, and more mitzvot, a plentiful amount of mitzvot. But if you look in the verse, what does the verse say? The verse says, Lahagdal Torah v'yadir. V'yadir means to glorify. That's really a concept of quality. That's something that's an essential qualitative type of greatness. It's not something that you can quantify. It's something you can count in number. And the question then again is, what is the difference, the discrepancy? Here it comes out that he makes an emphasis on the quantity, the amount of Torah mitzvahs that there are, and here it seems to be in the verse itself, an emphasis on the quality. So the Rebbe explains, to understand all this, when we say that Hashem made many Torah mitzvot, that he made a plentiful amount, an abundance, we don't necessarily mean with this the number 613 per se. You see, because really, there is no point of reference to have any kind of determination or an idea as to how many mitzvahs there, quote, should be. In other words, any amount of mitzvahs we have, we can always ask, why not less? Why not more? Right? So that is not what he means by Hirba Lahem Torah mitzvahs, that he made a abundance of Torah mitzvahs. Because we really don't know how many mitzvahs, quote unquote, there should be. Rather, it's referring to the mere fact that there are many mitzvot. In other words, that there are more than one mitzvah, that there's more than one concept in the Torah. That in itself already is an abundance, and that is in itself what leads to the fulfillment of the quality and the purpose of the Torah. Again, the fact that there is more than one mitzvah, the fact that there's more than one concept, so to speak, in the Torah. In other words, the fact that there is a multitude, the fact that there is more than one idea, more than one point, that in itself is the abundance. That in itself is the abundance in the quantity, which brings to the greatness, so to speak, abundance in the quality. And that's what the Rambam means. When the Rambam says that because there is an abundance, that way we are assured, there is a certainty. In other words, Hashem made it possible that every single Jew should be able to fulfill at least one mitzvah in its entirety, and it's in proper manner, in its proper form. That is the whole idea, the whole purpose of the Torah mitzvahs. The purpose of Torah mitzvahs is the person connects to Hashem, that the person implement the Torah mitzvahs, and therefore, and that's why the Torah was given, and therefore, by having an abundance, and thus assuring that a person would be able to for sure fulfill it, to implement this purpose, and fulfill his purpose of doing at least one mitzvah properly, 100%, this adds to the quality of the whole entire idea of Torah mitzvahs. To explain this a little better, let's take a little deeper look at Torah mitzvahs. Because if you think about it, look at Torah, for example, and look at mitzvahs. You see so many opposites, so many differences. There seems to be a great multitude of different factors, of different points, of different ideas. Let's take mitzvahs, for example, without getting into too much detail. But you have already a breakdown between the two types of mitzvot, right? The two types of mitzvot. You have the positive commandments, you have the negative commandments. So already you have two different types of mitzvot. And then you have, in the mitzvot itself, you have the three groups, Eidos, Chukim, Mishpatim. You have the Mishpatim, those mitzvahs that are justified by one's mind, the mitzvahs that are very typically understood. Then you have the testimonials, like the various festivals, the various things we do to commemorate things. And then you have the chukim, which are literally translated as statutes, which are things that even the human mind cannot wrap itself around, the human mind cannot understand. So you already see that in mitzvot you have all kinds of varying groups and varying categories. There is no unity. There seems to be a multitude of different things in mitzvot. Now take the Torah itself. As we find quite often, in the Torah itself, every single detail in the Torah, every single point in the Torah could be understood in so many different ways, to the extent that even the sages tell us that there is 60 ribui, shishim ribui, which means 600,000 ways to explain each idea in the Torah, each point in the Torah. And each one of them is correct. So the question is, the Torah is one Torah, from one Hashem, comes from one God, and it comes for one people, the Am Echad, the Jewish people. And if that's the case, how is it possible that there should be such a great plurality in Torah and mitzvahs? It doesn't make sense. If anything, there should be a oneness. You should feel, see, and recognize the oneness in Torah and mitzvahs, and the opposite is the truth. There's so much plurality in everything that's in Torah and mitzvahs. Any verse, any mitzvah, there's so many details, there's so many opposites, there's so many things, so many moving parts. And the question is, why? How could it be? How is that consistent with the fact that the Torah is one Torah from one Hashem? And the answer is that since the whole purpose, the whole objective of Torah mitzvahs is to, quote, make a dwelling place for him down here below. Lasas lo yisborach dir betachtonim. Now, the tachton, the lower part, meaning the world down here, is divided into so many different parts and so many different things and so many different aspects and so many different concepts. There's plurality. And therefore, since Hashem wanted, as we say, lizakos es Yisrael, what does lizakos mean? It doesn't mean just to give them merit so they can score some points so they can get some reward. But rather, lizakos comes from the word zichuch, which means to purify, to refine. Since Hashem wanted to refine the Jew, and that through that, to refine the world, what does it mean that Hashem should be able to dwell down here? That he should be, quote, comfortable here. In order for him to be comfortable here, the here, meaning the down here, the world, has to become refined, has to be purified. Think about it. You want a king to dwell in your house, you clean the place out, you make sure that it's befitting the presence of such a great personality, of such a great entity. So Hashem wanted to refine the Jew, and through that refine the world, that every spot, every point that's connected to the person should become refined. And therefore, there is a plenitude. There's such a multitude. Such an abundance of mitzvahs and Torah, in order that every single detail of the person and of the world has some connection, something that can connect specifically to that, a mitzvah or a detail in a mitzvah, a concept or an idea in the Torah that can connect specifically to that aspect of things, to that particular point, to that particular aspect of the person, in order to refine it. And this does not negate the oneness of Hashem. On the contrary, since the whole purpose is to do what? To make a dwelling place for him, meaning that he, Hashem, in the world that he created down here with so many different parts, with so many different details, he should find a dwelling place in each and every aspect of creation, and specifically the person, the Jew. Therefore, specifically through refining every aspect of the person, or potential, there being a potential that every single detail of the person and the world that's connected to the person should be able to be refined, should be able to be elevated, should be able to become a dira lo yisbarech, a, quote, dwelling place for Hashem. That brings to the ultimate unity, to the ultimate oneness with Hashem. And now we can understand those questions, that we can answer the questions, those seeming discrepancies in the verbiage, in the expression between the Mishnah, the way it expresses, and the verse. You see, in the verse it said that Hashem desires for his own righteousness, Leman Sidko. And in the Mishnah, Rabbi Chananya said what? That he desired, that Hashem wanted for the sake of the Jews. He wanted to make the Jews refined. He wanted to elevate the Jews. That's all consistent. It's true. In order for Hashem, so to speak, to get his desire of what? Of having his righteousness, which is what? His desire met, of having a dir b'tachtonim, the Jew needs to be refined. So by refining the Jew, by Hashem making an abundance for the sake of the Jew, he's really making it for the sake of himself. The next question was also regarding Ratzain versus Chafetz, desire versus want. If you think about it, what is really the true meaning of the word desire? Desire is a very inner thing. Desire really, as explained in Chassidus, comes from the highest point of the soul. In fact, the highest point of the soul is in general is one's will. But more specifically, the highest point, the pinnacle of it, is desire. Desire is synonymous with pleasure. It means it's something that you want, something that is as if you have an inner desire that will bring you happiness, will bring you pleasure. It's really all and mostly about you, what you feel, what you enjoy, so to speak. Versus the word ratza and want. Want already indicates a connection to something outside of yourself. You want something. You want the thing that's there. There has to be, so to speak, an entity outside of yourself, separate from you, that you now want. So this is the difference in nuance. In the verse where we're talking about the inner desire of Hashem, so to speak, before it manifests itself into the world, before it develops and evolves into becoming a whole world and the Torah and the mitzvahs with all their detail, that's where the verse uses the term chafetz, desire, because it's about Him, it's about Hashem. But once we're referring to the Jews and in the abundance of Torah mitzvahs, and that is, as we explained, taking into consideration and making it, so to speak, compatible and available for all the varying details of the world, something, so to speak, outside of Hashem, that's where we use the term ratzon. And then once again, the difference between the verse that only quotes Torah versus the Mishnah, B'chani B'akashya, that says Torah and mitzvos. You see, because once again, in the essence of Hashem, meaning in the core of things, it's all about Torah. It starts off with Torah. Later, as it manifests itself, later as it develops, so to speak, as it evolves, as it comes down here, it develops into all the details in the Torah, including all the varying mitzvos and all the varying details in the mitzvos. So then once again, you see how it starts in the core, what Hashem's desire was, and how it develops, how it evolves, and it becomes possible for it to happen and come back up to Hashem and be elevated. In order for the Torah, so to speak, to become even greater, even more elevated, that's why Hashem sends it down here, and it goes into all this process of becoming all these details. It goes, so to speak, from the written law, which is really a synopsis. It's really just a core, just a seminal point of everything, and later gets broadened and gets developed and evolves into so many details and aspects and thoughts in the Torah Sheba'al Peh, in the oral law, and through that, the Torah itself up there gets enhanced. And this is reflected also in the difference of the expression. In the Torah Shebiksav, in the written Torah, which is the core, right? Over there you see it says chafetz, desire. It says tzitko, His righteousness, because it's about Him. Over there it's the core of things, and it only mentions Torah. But once it manifests itself, as it's being described in the words of Chananya ben Akashya, how it develops and how it evolves and comes down here, over there, meaning how it expounds. Over here already, the Torah, the expression is ratza, He wanted, as we explained. And it doesn't talk about sitko, but rather lizakos es Yisrael. It refers to the refinement of the Jewish person, of the Jewish people. And then again, it goes into detail, not just Torah, but Torah and mitzvahs. And now we'll get a better appreciation of this core connection between this, the Pirkei Avos, and this Mishnah of Chananya ben Akashya. Because really the question could be asked in general, why Pirkei Avos? What is this Pirkei Avos all about? Pirkei Avos is obviously a part of the Torah, it's a part of the Talmud. But what is it for? What is it there for? If you look at most of the Pirkei Avos, what does it talk about? Like I mentioned in the introduction, all this interpersonal behavioral good deeds, good morals, and so on, refined ways of behaving. But if you think about it, is the Torah the only source for this? In fact, there are so many books, there's so much literature written about this by tremendously great scholars and thinkers who were able to bring out truly what good morals are, what good ethics are, what good, decorum is, what good behavior is, and how one should be refined. In other words, does Torah really hold a patent exclusivity on this? There are other people also in the world, non-Jews, who also came up with tremendously good ideas of how to behave and how to live a purposeful and meaningful life without hurting somebody else, without, being a pest to society, with, being a good citizen. Torah is the only one that has the rules, so to speak, has the idea of how to be a good citizen. There's so many others that did, so many societies that had very, very good ways of living life and of expressing good manner and good behavior. Why is it that we need Pirkei Avot? That is precisely the purpose which we mentioned before. Because since the reason of the Torah is how it manifests itself down here into Torah and mitzvos, and becomes the tools through which one can refine the world. For what purpose? For what end? To make a dwelling place for Hashem down here in this world. Therefore, it has to encompass, it has to, so to speak, conquer every single point, every single aspect of the world. In other words, not just remain exclusive to the, quote, holy things, but even typical things like behaviors of how one behaves with another person. Not that it should merely be on the level of not to be, so to speak, a nuisance to society, but rather to become merititious. By the Torah talking about it, making it a value of the Torah, making it something which is a refinement that comes through Torah. Now it's not just merely behaving so you don't get into trouble. Now it's not just merely behaving in a certain manner so you don't bother another person, so you don't hurt your neighbors, so you don't disrupt society. But rather this becomes another means of refining the world, of elevating the world. The person himself becomes refined, and the person himself becomes holy by behaving in these ways. And through that, makes the world refined, makes the world holy, brings the world closer to Hashem, and thus makes the world one with Hashem, which is the ultimate point.